Picture this. You are walking through the marble corridors of the Apostolic Palace on a crisp autumn evening in 1501. The flickering candlelight casts dancing shadows against the frescoed walls as you make your way towards the papal apartments. The air is thick with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine, but underneath lies something else, something that makes your stomach churn with unease. You are Johann Burchard, Master of Ceremonies to His Holiness Pope Alexander VI, and tonight you will witness an event so shocking, so thoroughly degrading to the sacred office you serve, that 5 centuries later, historians will still debate whether such depravity could truly have occurred within these hallowed walls. That night would become known as the Banquet of Chestnuts, and you are about to discover that even the most powerful religious institution on earth can become a stage for humanity's darkest impulses. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the profound moral collapse that allegedly unfolded on October 30th, 1501, we must first grasp the toxic atmosphere that had infected the very heart of Christendom during the Renaissance. The papacy of Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, represented the absolute nadir of ecclesiastical corruption, a period when the successor to Saint Peter operated more like a Renaissance prince than a shepherd of souls. The Borgia family had clawed their way to power through a calculated mixture of bribery, blackmail, and bloodshed. When Rodrigo Borgia bought his way to the papal throne in 1492, he brought with him not just his towering ambition, but a poisonous legacy of nepotism that would contaminate every sacred institution he touched. Unlike previous popes who had discreetly enriched their relatives, Alexander VI brazenly elevated his illegitimate children to positions of unprecedented power. His son Cesare became a cardinal at 17, while his daughter Lucrezia was married off in a series of strategic alliances designed to expand Borgia influence across Italy. This wasn't merely political corruption. It was the systematic desecration of everything the Church claimed to represent. The man who claimed to be Christ's vicar on earth lived openly with his mistresses, fathered children with impunity, and transformed the Vatican into what contemporary observers described as a den of thieves. The psychological impact on the faithful was devastating. How could they trust in the sanctity of the sacraments when the hands that blessed them belonged to a man who embodied every sin the Church condemned? At the center of this moral wasteland stood Johann Burchard, a German cleric whose meticulous diary would preserve one of history's most scandalous accounts. As Master of Ceremonies, Burchard was responsible for maintaining the dignity and proper protocol of papal functions. Day after day, he watched the sacred rituals of his faith twisted into grotesque parodies by men who had forgotten they were supposed to be servants of God. The psychological torment Burchard endured cannot be overstated. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to the Church, who believed deeply in its mission and sanctity, forced to witness its systematic degradation from within. His diary entries reveal a soul in constant anguish. torn between his duty to record events faithfully and his desperate desire to protect the institution he loved from further scandal. Borgia had already documented years of Borgia excess, the blatant simony, the murderous feuds between papal children, the transformation of St. Peter's Basilica into a marketplace for political favors. Each entry in his Liber Notarum was another nail in the coffin of his faith, another piece of evidence of how thoroughly power had corrupted those who claimed to speak for Christ. By the autumn of 1501, Burchard was a broken man, spiritually exhausted by the relentless parade of scandals he was required to witness and document. But nothing could have prepared him for what would unfold that October evening in Cesare Borgia's apartments. According to Burchard's account, the evening began deceptively normally. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's second son, had organized what appeared to be another in the endless series of banquets celebrating his sister Lucrezia's upcoming marriage. The guest list included the highest levels of church hierarchy, cardinals, bishops, and other prelates who had gathered ostensibly to honor the papal family. But 50 additional guests had been invited to this particular gathering. Women Burchard described as honest prostitutes or courtesans. These were not common streetwalkers, but educated, sophisticated women who served Rome's elite. Their presence at a Vatican banquet, while inappropriate, was not entirely unprecedented in the debauched atmosphere of Alexander VI's court. The horror began after the sumptuous meal had concluded and the wine had flowed freely. Burchard watched in stunned disbelief as candelabras were removed from the tables and placed on the floor, creating pools of flickering light across the marble. Chestnuts were scattered across the floor between the burning candles, setting the stage for what would follow. The courtesans, who had initially danced while clothed, began to disrobe entirely. Naked, they crawled on hands and knees between the flames, collecting the chestnuts in their mouths, while Pope Alexander VI, his son Cesare, and his daughter Lucrezia watched from their elevated positions. The symbolism was as nauseating as it was deliberate. These women, created in God's image, reduced two animals crawling on the floor for the entertainment of the church's highest officials. But the degradation had only just begun. What followed, according to Burchard's account, was an organized orgy in which prizes were offered to those who could perform sexual acts most frequently with the courtesans. Silk tunics, shoes, and other luxuries were distributed as rewards by the Pope himself. The man who claimed to be the representative of Christ on earth, now acting as the master of ceremonies for a competition of lust. The psychological impact on witnesses like Burchard was profound and lasting. Here was a man whose entire worldview depended on the sanctity of his religious superiors, watching that sanctity being torn apart in the most visceral way imaginable. The trauma of witnessing such systematic dehumanization, not just of the women involved, but of everyone present, would haunt him for the rest of his life. While Burchard's account focuses primarily on the shocking behavior of the church hierarchy, we must pause to consider the true victims of that night, the 50 women whose humanity was stripped away along with their clothing. These courtesans were not willing participants in some grand adventure. They were women trapped in a society that gave them no alternatives, forced to degrade themselves for the entertainment of men who held absolute power over their lives. In Renaissance Rome, courtesans occupied a precarious position. Unlike common prostitutes, they were often educated and cultured, serving as companions to wealthy and powerful men. But their elevated status was entirely dependent on their ability to please their patrons. They had no legal rights, no protection from abuse, and no recourse when powerful men decided to use them as props in their twisted games. The women forced to crawl naked across the Vatican floor that night were experiencing a form of spiritual murder. They were being systematically dehumanized in the very heart of an institution that preached the infinite worth of every human soul. The psychological damage inflicted on them, the humiliation, the degradation, the utter powerlessness would have been devastating and permanent. Some of these women likely had children to feed, debts to pay, or families dependent on their earnings. They couldn't refuse the Pope's son without risking not just their livelihoods, but potentially their lives. The Borgias were known for their violent retribution against those who defied them. These women faced an impossible choice: submit to degradation or face potential starvation, violence, or death. The trauma extended beyond the physical acts themselves. These women were being used as instruments to corrupt and compromise the church's highest officials. They were unwilling accomplices in the destruction of an institution that, for all its flaws, represented hope and meaning for millions of believers. The psychological burden of being forced to participate in such sacrilege would have been unbearable for anyone with a functioning conscience. Among the most tragic figures in Burchard's account are the cardinals and bishops who allegedly participated in the night's debauchery. These were men who had taken sacred vows, who had promised to serve God and protect the faithful. Their transformation from shepherds of souls into participants in an orgy represents one of the most complete moral collapses in recorded history. To understand the magnitude of their fall, we must remember what these men were supposed to represent. Cardinals were considered the Pope's closest advisors, men chosen for their wisdom, piety, and moral authority. They wore red vestments, symbolizing their willingness to shed their blood for the faith. They were expected to be living examples of Christian virtue, guides for the faithful in their spiritual journey. The psychological processes that led these men to participate in such degradation are complex and disturbing. Years of witnessing and participating in Borgia corruption had clearly eroded their moral foundations. They had become so accustomed to compromise, so inured to scandal, that the unthinkable had become merely another transgression in a long series of betrayals. But participating in the banquet of chestnuts represented a point of no return. These men weren't simply engaging in private sin. They were publicly desecrating their sacred office in the most visible and humiliating way possible. They were allowing themselves to be reduced to animals in heat, competing for prizes like trained dogs performing tricks for their master. The morning after must have brought crushing psychological torment. How do you celebrate Mass after participating in an orgy? How do you administer the sacraments with hands that have touched prostitutes in full view of the Pope? How do you preach about sin and redemption when you have become the very embodiment of corruption you're supposed to combat? Many of these men likely suffered complete psychological breakdowns. Some may have sought to rationalize their behavior, convincing themselves that their participation was somehow justified or necessary. Others may have been driven to despair, unable to reconcile their actions with their professed beliefs. The spiritual damage inflicted on these men, and through them on the entire church, was incalculable. If Burchard's account is accurate, Pope Alexander VI's role in the banquet of chestnuts represents perhaps the most complete betrayal of religious trust in human history. Here was the man who claimed to be the successor to Saint Peter, the one person on earth who spoke with divine authority, reduced to distributing prizes at a sexual competition. The psychological profile of Alexander VI that emerges from this incident is deeply disturbing. This wasn't a moment of weakness or poor judgment. It was the calculated degradation of the highest office in Christianity for personal entertainment. The Pope wasn't a helpless bystander or reluctant participant. According to Burchard, he was an active facilitator, personally rewarding those who performed best in the sexual contests. The level of narcissism required for such behavior is staggering. Alexander VI had become so convinced of his own infallibility, so intoxicated by absolute power, that he apparently believed he could transform even the most sacred institutions into instruments of his personal pleasure. He had lost all connection to the spiritual responsibilities of his office, seeing the papacy merely as a tool for advancing his family's political and financial interests. The psychological impact on Alexander VI himself may have been even more devastating than the trauma he inflicted on others. To maintain any semblance of mental stability while living such a profound contradiction would have required an almost complete disconnection from reality. He would have had to construct an elaborate internal narrative justifying his behavior, perhaps convincing himself that his actions were somehow serving a greater purpose, or that normal moral rules didn't apply to someone in his position. But deep beneath the layers of rationalization and self-deception, Alexander VI must have known what he had become. In his private moments, away from the sycophants and enablers, he would have been forced to confront the reality that he had transformed the papacy, the most sacred office in Christianity, into a vehicle for his own depravity. The psychological torment of living with such knowledge would have been unbearable for anyone with a functioning conscience. Among the most heartbreaking aspects of Burchard's account is the presence of Lucrezia Borgia at the evening's debauchery. At 19 years old, she was forced to witness this systematic degradation while trapped in an impossible situation by the machinations of her father and brother. Lucrezia's psychological state during the banquet of chestnuts can only be imagined, but it must have been a waking nightmare. She was supposed to represent virginal purity in preparation for her upcoming marriage, yet here she was, being forced to observe the most degrading sexual spectacle imaginable. The cognitive dissonance alone would have been devastating. As a woman in Renaissance society, Lucrezia had no power to protest or leave. She was entirely dependent on her male relatives for protection and survival. If she objected to their behavior or refused to participate in their gatherings, she risked not just their displeasure, but potentially her life. The Borgias were known for their ruthless elimination of family members who proved inconvenient. The trauma of witnessing such systematic dehumanization particularly of women like herself, would have left permanent psychological scars. Lucrezia was being taught, in the most visceral way possible, that women existed solely for male pleasure and amusement. She was seeing her own future reflected in the naked bodies crawling across the floor, understanding at a fundamental level that her value was purely instrumental. The forced complicity was perhaps the cruelest aspect of her situation. By remaining present and silent, Lucrezia was being made an accomplice to the degradation of other women. The guilt and shame associated with this unwilling participation would have haunted her for the rest of her life. She would carry the knowledge that she had been present, had been a Borgia, during one of the most shameful episodes in church history. Modern psychological research on trauma suggests that witnessing systematic violence and degradation can be as damaging as experiencing it directly. Lucrezia's forced observation of the banquet of chestnuts would have inflicted lasting psychological wounds. Complex PTSD, dissociation, and a profound mistrust of the men who claimed to love and protect her. Often overlooked in discussions of the banquet of chestnuts are the dozens of servants and attendants who would have been present throughout the evening. These individuals, cooks, waiters, guards, and other household staff, were the invisible witnesses to corruption, forced to maintain silence about what they saw while knowing that speaking out would mean certain death. The psychological burden carried by these servants was immense. They were predominantly devout Catholics who had dedicated their lives to serving the church. Many had likely joined the papal household, believing they were participating in something sacred and meaningful. Instead, they found themselves complicit in the systematic destruction of everything they held dear. The servants who cleared away the dishes after the meal would have known what was coming. Those who repositioned the candelabras would have understood their role in facilitating degradation. The guards who stood watch outside the doors were protecting not a sacred gathering, but an orgy. Each of these individuals was forced to choose between their moral conscience and their physical survival. And survival won. The psychological mechanisms these servants employed to cope with such cognitive dissonance were likely complex and varied. Some may have convinced themselves that they were simply following orders, that the moral responsibility lay with their superiors. Others may have dissociated emotionally, treating their work as purely mechanical tasks divorced from their moral implications. But the trauma was inescapable. These servants went home each night carrying the weight of what they had witnessed and enabled. They attended Mass in their local parishes, receiving communion from priests who would have been horrified by what was happening in the Vatican. They lived double lives. Publicly pious Catholics, privately accomplices to sacrilege. The servants' families were also unwilling participants in this web of corruption. Wives and children noticed the psychological changes in their loved ones, but were powerless to help. The servants couldn't explain their growing despair, their loss of faith, their nightmares and anxiety, without revealing secrets that would result in their execution. Entire families were thus infected by the trauma of Borgia corruption, suffering in silence while maintaining a facade of normal Catholic life. The psychological torment associated with the banquet of chestnuts extends even to modern scholars who have studied the event. Professional historians face a unique form of intellectual anguish when confronting Burchard's account. They must grapple with evidence of human depravity so extreme that their professional instincts revolt against accepting it as fact. This scholarly struggle represents more than academic dispute. It reflects the profound human need to believe that certain moral boundaries cannot be crossed, that some institutions remain fundamentally decent regardless of individual corruption. The idea that the papacy itself could be reduced to facilitating orgies challenges basic assumptions about human nature and institutional resilience. Historians who accept Burchard's account as accurate must confront their own psychological responses to systematic degradation. They must maintain professional objectivity while studying events that trigger visceral disgust and moral outrage. This emotional labor, the requirement to analyze and discuss such depravity with scholarly detachment, takes a significant psychological toll. Conversely, historians who question or dismiss Burchard's account face their own psychological challenges. They must explain away detailed contemporary testimony without appearing to engage in institutional apologetics. They must construct alternative narratives that account for the documented evidence while preserving their own moral universe. This process of rationalization and reinterpretation can be equally traumatic, as it requires the constant suppression of uncomfortable truths. The ongoing scholarly debate about the banquet of chestnuts thus becomes a form of collective psychological defense mechanism. By focusing on questions of evidence and interpretation, historians can avoid confronting the full implications of what may have occurred. They can maintain intellectual distance from events that, if accepted as fact, would fundamentally challenge their understanding of human nature and institutional morality. The long-term psychological and spiritual consequences of Borgia corruption extended far beyond the immediate participants in the banquet of chestnuts. The systematic degradation of papal authority during Alexander VI's reign planted seeds of doubt and rebellion that would bear bitter fruit in the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Castle Church in 1517, he was responding not just to specific theological disputes, but to the profound moral crisis that had infected the entire Catholic Church. The memory of Borgia scandals, including events like the alleged banquet of chestnuts, had created a reservoir of popular anger and disgust that reformers could tap into. Ordinary Catholics across Europe carried the psychological burden of knowing that their spiritual leaders had been exposed as hypocrites and degenerates. They had been taught to revere the Pope as Christ's representative on earth, only to discover that he had allegedly presided over orgies and sexual competitions. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming and permanent. This spiritual trauma manifested itself in various ways throughout the early 16th century. Some Catholics became cynical and secular, abandoning religious faith entirely. Others channeled their anger into support for reform movements that promised to restore moral authority to Christianity. Still, others retreated into private devotion, seeking spiritual meaning outside institutional structures they could no longer trust. The Protestant Reformation thus represents in part a massive collective psychological response to Borgia-era trauma. Entire populations were seeking to heal from the spiritual wounds inflicted by papal corruption. The violence and bitterness that characterized the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries reflected not just theological disagreement, but the deep psychological damage inflicted by the systematic betrayal of religious trust. The Catholic Church's eventual response, the Counter-Reformation, can be understood as an institutional attempt to process and heal from the trauma of its own corruption. The Council of Trent, the Inquisition, and the various reform movements within Catholicism were all efforts to restore moral credibility and spiritual authority after the devastating psychological impact of the Borgia years. The psychological dynamics revealed in the banquet of chestnuts, the abuse of power, the systematic dehumanization, the corruption of institutions meant to protect the vulnerable, continue to resonate in contemporary scandals. The Catholic Church's ongoing struggles with sexual abuse, financial corruption, and institutional cover-ups can be traced directly back to the patterns established during the Renaissance papacy. The trauma experienced by modern victims of clerical abuse mirrors, in many ways, the psychological damage inflicted on the courtesans forced to crawl naked across the Vatican floor in 1501. The same institutional indifference to suffering, the same prioritization of reputation over justice, the same willful blindness to the human cost of corruption. All these elements persist across centuries. Contemporary Catholics face psychological challenges similar to those confronted by believers in Burchard's time. They must reconcile their faith in church teachings with evidence of systematic institutional failure. They must maintain spiritual commitment to an organization that has repeatedly betrayed the values it claims to represent. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming and permanent. The modern church's response to scandal also echoes Renaissance patterns. Like Alexander VI's supporters, contemporary apologists often resort to denying, minimizing, or rationalizing institutional failures. They construct elaborate justifications for unjustifiable behavior, attacking accusers rather than addressing accusations. The psychological mechanisms of institutional protection remain unchanged across centuries. Understanding the banquet of chestnuts thus becomes more than an exercise in historical curiosity. It provides crucial insight into the psychology of institutional corruption and the human cost of unchecked power. The patterns established in 1501 continue to shape our world today, making this dark chapter in church history disturbingly relevant to contemporary concerns. The alleged events of October 30th, 1501 force us to confront fundamental questions about human nature, institutional morality, and the psychology of power that remain as relevant today as they were 5 centuries ago. Can absolute power ever coexist with moral authority? Is it possible for institutions to maintain their spiritual credibility while systematically betraying their foundational values? How do we process the cognitive dissonance of discovering that our most trusted authorities are capable of unthinkable depravity? These questions extend far beyond the Catholic Church or even religious institutions generally. They apply to any organization that claims moral authority: governments, educational institutions, charitable organizations, even family structures. The banquet of chestnuts serves as a case study in how power corrupts not just individuals, but entire systems. creating cascading trauma that affects everyone connected to the institution. And the psychological impact of institutional betrayal is particularly devastating because it attacks our most basic assumptions about moral order and social stability. When the Pope, the supposed representative of ultimate moral authority, is reduced to distributing prizes at a sexual competition, every other institutional claim to moral credibility becomes suspect. The foundation of social trust begins to crumble, leaving individuals psychologically adrift in a world where nothing can be taken at face value. This explains why events like the Banquet of Chestnuts have such lasting power to shock and traumatize. They represent more than individual moral failure. They reveal the fundamental fragility of the moral frameworks that give life meaning and order. They force us to confront the possibility that our most cherished institutions are nothing more than elaborate facades concealing human depravity. As we reflect on this dark chapter in church history, we must remember that behind every scandal, every act of corruption, every abuse of power, there are human beings whose lives were forever altered by the actions of those in authority. The 50 women forced to crawl naked across the Vatican floor, the servants who watched in silent horror, the faithful Catholics whose trust was betrayed, the historians who struggle to make sense of evidence that challenges their faith in human decency. All deserve to be remembered not just as historical footnotes, but as individuals whose suffering matters. The courtesans who participated in the Banquet of Chestnuts were not willing participants in some grand historical drama. They were human beings trapped in impossible circumstances, forced to degrade themselves for the entertainment of men who held absolute power over their lives. Their humanity was stripped away along with their clothing, their dignity sacrificed to satisfy the twisted appetites of their betters. They deserve to be remembered not as objects of historical curiosity, but as victims of systematic abuse whose suffering was real and lasting. Johann Burchard, the master of ceremonies, whose diary preserved this account for posterity, was also a victim. A man whose faith was systematically destroyed by the very institution he served. His meticulous records represent more than historical documentation. They are the testimony of a soul in torment, a faithful servant forced to witness the systematic destruction of everything he held sacred. His psychological suffering was as real and significant as any physical abuse. The Catholic faithful of the Renaissance era, who discovered that their spiritual fathers were capable of unthinkable depravity, experienced a form of collective trauma that reverberates to this day. Their trust was betrayed, their faith was shattered, their understanding of moral order was permanently damaged. They were the unwilling inheritors of corruption they had no power to prevent or remedy. Even the perpetrators of these alleged crimes, Pope Alexander VI, his son Cesare, and the cardinals who supposedly participated, were, in their own way, victims of the corrupting influence of absolute power. They became monsters not through some inherent evil, but through the systematic erosion of moral boundaries that unchecked authority inevitably produces. Their transformation from servants of God into facilitators of degradation represents a form of spiritual suicide that should serve as a warning to anyone who wields significant power. The Banquet of Chestnuts, whether it occurred exactly as Burchard described or was embellished by the Pope's enemies, represents more than a single night of debauchery. It symbolizes the complete moral collapse that occurs when institutions abandon their foundational principles in pursuit of power and pleasure. The psychological damage inflicted by such betrayals extends far beyond the immediate participants, creating waves of trauma that affect entire generations. The legacy of Borgia corruption continues to poison the Catholic Church to this day. Every modern scandal, every cover-up, every abuse of authority can be traced back to the patterns established during the Renaissance papacy. The institutional reflexes that protected Alexander VI, the prioritization of reputation over justice, the willingness to sacrifice victims for institutional interests, the elaborate rationalizations that transform obvious wrongs into necessary evils, persist unchanged across centuries. But the poisonous legacy extends beyond institutional boundaries. The banquet of chestnuts serves as a template for how power corrupts not just individuals, but entire systems. The psychological mechanisms that enabled such extreme degradation, the gradual erosion of moral boundaries, the normalization of increasingly corrupt behavior, the complicity of those who remain silent in the face of obvious wrong, can be observed in every context where absolute power meets insufficient accountability. The fundamental question remains: can institutions ever truly reform themselves after such complete moral collapse? The Catholic Church's ongoing struggles with abuse and corruption suggest that the answer may be no, that some forms of institutional trauma are so severe, so deeply embedded in organizational culture, that they cannot be overcome through conventional reform efforts. The patterns established in 1501 may be so deeply ingrained that they have become permanent features of institutional DNA. This raises profound questions about the nature of institutional redemption and the possibility of genuine moral renewal. If the Catholic Church, with its vast resources, global influence, and centuries of accumulated wisdom, cannot overcome the legacy of Renaissance corruption, what hope do other institutions have when faced with similar moral crises? The banquet of chestnuts thus becomes not just a historical curiosity, but a case study in institutional pathology with urgent contemporary relevance. The night of October 30th, 1501, stands as a monument to human moral failure, a reminder that no institution, no matter how sacred or powerful, is immune to the corrupting influence of unchecked authority. The psychological trauma inflicted by such systematic betrayal of trust continues to reverberate through history, affecting not just direct participants, but entire cultures and civilizations. As we confront our own institutional failures and moral crises, we would do well to remember the women who crawled naked across the Vatican floor, the faithful servant who recorded their degradation, and the millions of believers whose trust was betrayed by those who claimed to speak for God. Their suffering reminds us that behind every scandal, every abuse of power, every institutional failure, there are human beings whose lives are forever altered by the actions of those in authority. Beyond the immediate participants in that October night lay a vast network of complicity that extended throughout Renaissance Rome and beyond. Cardinals who weren't present but knew of the Pope's behavior and chose silence over protest. Bishops who continued to support the Borgia regime despite overwhelming evidence of corruption. wealthy patrons who funded papal excesses while turning blind eyes to their moral implications. Each of these individuals carried their own burden of psychological trauma, the weight of knowing they were accomplices to the systematic destruction of Christianity's moral authority. The Roman nobility who attended other Borgia gatherings faced constant cognitive dissonance. They were devout Catholics who attended Mass regularly, confessed their sins, and raised their children in the faith. Yet they also socialized with and financially supported men who had allegedly presided over orgies in the papal apartments. The psychological gymnastics required to maintain both positions simultaneously would have been exhausting and spiritually devastating. Merchant families who profited from Vatican contracts lived with the knowledge that their wealth was built on corruption. They saw firsthand how papal funds were diverted from charitable works to finance lavish entertainments and political schemes. Their children grew up understanding that success required moral compromise, that virtue was a luxury the ambitious could not afford. The psychological damage inflicted on entire generations of Roman society was incalculable. The broader European Catholic community also bore the burden of institutional betrayal. Reports of papal scandals spread through diplomatic channels and merchant networks, reaching the furthest corners of Christendom. Faithful Catholics in England, France, Germany, and Spain discovered that their spiritual father was allegedly distributing prizes at sexual competitions. The trauma of this revelation shattered assumptions about moral order that had anchored their worldview for centuries. Within the labyrinthine corridors of the Vatican itself, dozens of additional individuals carried the psychological burden of the Borgia years. Librarians who catalogued papal documents knew the full extent of corruption but were bound by sacred oaths of secrecy. Guards who protected papal apartments understood what activities they were facilitating but could not speak without facing execution. Priests who celebrated Mass in Vatican chapels struggled to maintain faith while surrounded by evidence of systematic sacrilege. The Vatican's administrative apparatus, the vast bureaucracy that governed the Catholic Church, was particularly traumatized by the moral collapse of their institution. These were men who had dedicated their lives to serving God through ecclesiastical channels, only to discover that their organization had become a vehicle for personal enrichment and debauchery. The psychological impact was devastating and permanent. Secretaries who transcribed papal correspondence witnessed the crude language and corrupt schemes that characterized Borgia communications. Treasurers who managed Vatican finances saw how donations from the faithful were diverted to fund orgies and political warfare. Diplomats who represented the Holy See to foreign courts struggled to maintain credibility while knowing their principals were moral degenerates. The international network of papal nuncios, ambassadors who represented Vatican interests across Europe, faced particularly acute psychological challenges. They were required to defend papal policies and request support for church initiatives while knowing that their superior had allegedly presided over competitions to see who could perform sex acts most frequently with prostitutes. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Many of these Vatican officials suffered what we would now recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. They developed elaborate psychological defense mechanisms to cope with the contradiction between their faith and their daily reality. Some rationalized the Pope's behavior as politically necessary. Others compartmentalized their religious beliefs, separating their private devotion from their professional obligations. Still others simply numbed themselves emotionally, treating their work as purely mechanical tasks divorced from moral significance. The banquet of chestnuts and other Borgia scandals created an unprecedented diplomatic crisis that reverberated throughout European courts. Foreign ambassadors stationed in Rome faced the impossible task of maintaining relations with the papal court they knew to be morally bankrupt. Their reports home were studies in diplomatic euphemism, carefully crafted to convey necessary information without explicitly acknowledging the full extent of papal depravity. The psychological burden on these diplomats was immense. They were representatives of Christian kingdoms who maintained their legitimacy partly through papal blessing. Yet, they were forced to negotiate with men who had allegedly transformed the seat of St. Peter into a brothel. The cognitive dissonance required massive psychological energy to maintain, leaving many diplomats spiritually and emotionally exhausted. French ambassadors struggled particularly with the moral implications of their alliance with Alexander VI. France had provided military support for Cesare Borgia's campaigns in exchange for papal backing of French interests in Italy. French officials thus became accomplices to Borgia, violence and corruption, compromising their own moral authority in the process. The psychological toll on individual diplomats who negotiated these agreements was severe and lasting. Spanish representatives faced even more complex challenges, as Alexander VI was himself Spanish and had numerous relatives seeking advancement through papal favor. Spanish courtiers found themselves torn between national loyalty and moral revulsion, unable to fully support or completely abandon their countrymen on the papal throne. The internal psychological conflict was devastating. German diplomats reported their observations of papal corruption to Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, who faced his own moral crisis in deciding how to respond. Should he break relations with Rome over moral concerns, potentially triggering a schism that would devastate Christendom? Or should he maintain diplomatic ties while knowing he was enabling systematic corruption? The psychological burden of such decisions weighed heavily on secular rulers throughout Europe. Perhaps the most tragic victims of the Borgia era were the children born into this environment of systematic moral collapse. Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia were raised in an atmosphere where violence, corruption, and sexual debauchery were normalized. Their psychological development was profoundly warped by constant exposure to behavior that contradicted everything their religion supposedly represented. Young Cesare learned that power justified any means necessary to maintain it. He witnessed his father use murder, bribery, and sexual coercion as routine tools of governance. The psychological impact of such education was devastating. Cesare grew into a man capable of extraordinary cruelty, apparently feeling no empathy for his victims because empathy had been systematically trained out of him during childhood. Lucrezia's psychological development was even more tragic. She learned that women existed solely for male pleasure and political advancement. Her marriages were arranged without her consent. Her children were taken from her when politically convenient, and she was forced to witness the degradation of other women while knowing she could be next. The trauma inflicted during her formative years shaped her entire worldview, leaving her unable to trust or form healthy relationships. The illegitimate children fathered by Alexander VI faced their own unique psychological challenges. They grew up knowing their father was the Pope, but could never publicly acknowledge the relationship. They enjoyed wealth and privilege, but lived with the constant knowledge that their very existence was evidence of their father's violation of sacred vows. The internal conflict between pride in their papal heritage and shame over their illegitimate status was psychologically devastating. Servants' children who grew up in Vatican households were also profoundly affected by the moral chaos surrounding them. They witnessed behavior that contradicted everything their parents had taught them about right and wrong. Many developed cynical worldviews at remarkably young ages, learning that virtue was a facade and power was the only reality that mattered. The broader community of Roman children during the Borgia era grew up in an atmosphere of normalized corruption. They learned that religious authority was a joke, that moral principles were tools for controlling the weak, and that success required abandoning conscience. The psychological damage inflicted on an entire generation helped perpetuate cycles of corruption that lasted for centuries. The Protestant Reformation, that erupted 16 years after the Banquet of Chestnuts, can be understood, in large part, as a massive collective psychological response to Borgia-era trauma. The systematic corruption of papal authority during Alexander VI's reign had created a reservoir of anger, disgust, and spiritual hunger that reformers like Martin Luther could tap into with devastating effectiveness. Luther's famous declaration that the Pope is the Antichrist resonated so powerfully because it gave voice to psychological truths that millions of Catholics had been afraid to acknowledge. They had witnessed or heard credible reports of papal behavior that contradicted everything they had been taught about Christian virtue. Luther provided both validation for their revulsion and a path forward that didn't require them to abandon Christianity entirely. The psychological appeal of Protestant theology lay partly in its promise to restore moral authority to Christianity. By rejecting papal supremacy and emphasizing direct relationships with God through Scripture, Protestantism offered believers a way to maintain their faith while escaping the moral compromises required by continued loyalty to Rome. The psychological relief was immense and permanent. German peasants who joined the Protestant movement weren't just responding to theological arguments. They were expressing their rage over decades of institutional betrayal. They had been taxed heavily to support a church that used their donations to fund orgies and political warfare. Their psychological need for justice and moral vindication found expression in religious revolution. The violence that characterized the early Reformation period reflected the depth of psychological trauma inflicted by papal corruption. Catholics and Protestants didn't just disagree about theology. They were processing collective trauma in fundamentally different ways. Catholics sought to reform the Church from within, while Protestants insisted that the institution was so thoroughly corrupted that it had to be abandoned entirely. Both responses were attempts to heal from spiritual wounds that ran incredibly deep. The Catholic Church's eventual response to Protestant challenges, the Counter-Reformation, represented a desperate institutional attempt to address the psychological damage inflicted by Renaissance corruption. The Council of Trent, which convened in 1545, was as much a therapy session as a theological conference, with church leaders struggling to rebuild moral credibility after decades of systematic betrayal. The psychological dynamics of the Counter-Reformation were complex and often contradictory. Church leaders simultaneously had to acknowledge that serious problems existed, while maintaining that the institution itself remained divinely ordained and morally authoritative. This required elaborate mental gymnastics that often produced more confusion than clarity. The establishment of the Roman Inquisition and the Index of Prohibited Books reflected the Church's psychological need to regain control over narrative. By suppressing competing interpretations of recent history and punishing those who publicized uncomfortable truths, church leaders hoped to create a new reality in which papal corruption could be minimized or denied entirely. The psychological energy required for such massive denial was enormous. Seminary reforms instituted during the Counter-Reformation represented genuine attempts to prevent future scandals by improving clerical education and discipline. But these reforms also reflected institutional trauma. The Church was so shaken by revelations of clerical corruption that it implemented systems of surveillance and control that transformed priestly formation into something resembling military training. The cult of saints that flourished during the Counter-Reformation can be understood partly as psychological compensation for papal failures. By emphasizing the virtue and holiness of canonized saints, the Church attempted to redirect attention away from the corruption of its highest officials. The psychological need for uncorrupted religious authority found expression in devotion to figures who were safely dead and couldn't disappoint the faithful through future scandals. Renaissance and Baroque art provides fascinating insight into how creative individuals processed the psychological trauma of institutional corruption. Artists who worked for papal patrons faced unique challenges in reconciling their artistic vision with the moral bankruptcy of their employers. The psychological tension often found expression in subtle but significant ways within their work. Michelangelo's relationship with papal authority was particularly complex and psychologically revealing. He created some of his greatest works for popes he personally despised, channeling his anger and disgust into artistic expression that simultaneously glorified and subtly mocked its subjects. The psychological burden of creating beauty in service of corruption left lasting marks on his personality and worldview. The prevalence of religious themes in Renaissance art takes on new meaning when understood in the context of institutional moral collapse. Artists weren't just celebrating faith, they were attempting to preserve spiritual ideals that had been abandoned by the Church's leadership. Their paintings and sculptures served as refuges for religious sentiment that could no longer find expression in actual ecclesiastical institutions. The emergence of increasingly dramatic and emotionally intense Baroque art can be understood partly as a response to Counter-Reformation psychological needs. The Church required art that could inspire intense emotional responses, capable of overwhelming intellectual doubts about institutional credibility. The psychological manipulation embedded in Baroque religious art was deliberate and sophisticated. Secular art that emerged during this period often contained subtle critiques of religious authority. Artists developed elaborate symbolic languages that allowed them to express their disgust with papal corruption while maintaining plausible deniability. The psychological satisfaction of embedding such messages in works destined for church walls must have been considerable. The financial implications of papal corruption extended far beyond the Vatican's walls, creating economic trauma that affected entire regions of Europe. The systematic diversion of church funds from charitable purposes to personal enrichment created cascading psychological effects throughout Catholic society. Hospitals and schools that depended on church funding found themselves starved of resources, while papal families accumulated enormous wealth. The psychological impact on patients who died from lack of medical care, or students who couldn't access education, or poor families who received no charitable assistance was profound and lasting. They learned that the Church's promises of care and support were meaningless when competing with papal ambition. The sale of indulgences, certificates promising reduced time in purgatory, became a particularly psychologically destructive form of spiritual extortion. Faithful Catholics were forced to choose between financial security and eternal salvation, creating impossible psychological burdens that tore families apart. The knowledge that their payments were funding papal orgies rather than genuine religious purposes added layers of rage and betrayal to their spiritual anxiety. Merchants and bankers who financed papal activities found themselves complicit in corruption they couldn't control or escape. They needed church connections to conduct business successfully, but maintaining those relationships required them to fund activities that violated their religious principles. The psychological toll of such moral compromise was severe and lasting. Regional economies throughout Italy became dependent on papal spending, creating perverse incentives that trapped entire communities in cycles of corruption. Towns that hosted papal courts prospered economically while suffering moral degradation. The psychological impact of witnessing one's community prosper through sin created lasting trauma that affected generations. The ripple effects of papal corruption extended far beyond Europe, affecting Catholic communities throughout the known world. Spanish colonies in the Americas received reports of papal scandals through missionary networks, creating profound psychological challenges for indigenous populations who had recently converted to Christianity. Native Americans who had accepted Catholic baptism based on promises of moral superiority over their traditional religions experienced devastating psychological trauma when they learned that Christian leaders were no more virtuous than the shamans and priests they had been taught to reject. The betrayal was particularly acute because conversion had often required them to abandon cultural practices that provided meaning and identity. Portuguese trading posts in Africa and Asia became conduits for spreading news of papal corruption throughout global Catholic networks. Local Christian communities struggled to maintain faith in institutions whose leaders had been exposed as moral degenerates. The psychological impact was particularly severe in societies where religious authority was closely tied to political legitimacy. Missionary priests working in remote locations faced unique psychological challenges when reports of papal scandals reached their communities. They had sacrificed comfortable European lives to spread Christianity, only to discover that their superiors had transformed the church into an instrument of personal pleasure. Many suffered complete psychological breakdowns, unable to reconcile their missionary calling with the reality of institutional corruption. The long-term impact on global Christianity was profound and lasting. The psychological wounds inflicted by Renaissance papal corruption continued to affect Catholic communities for centuries, creating vulnerabilities that Protestant missionaries would later exploit with devastating effectiveness. Contemporary writers and chroniclers who documented Borgia-era corruption faced their own psychological challenges in processing and communicating the full extent of institutional moral collapse. Many struggle with the problem of how to describe behavior so extreme that it challenged readers' ability to believe human beings were capable of such depravity. Diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals the psychological strain experienced by educated observers who felt obligated to record events that contradicted everything they had been taught about human nature and institutional behavior. Their carefully crafted euphemisms and coded language reflected desperate attempts to communicate uncomfortable truths without completely shattering social and religious assumptions. Popular literature of the period began incorporating increasingly dark themes of corruption and betrayal, reflecting broader cultural trauma over institutional failures. Stories that had once celebrated virtue and heroism gave way to cynical narratives emphasizing the futility of moral behavior in corrupt societies. The psychological shift was profound and lasting. Religious writers faced particularly acute challenges in maintaining faith while documenting evidence of systematic corruption within their own institution. Many developed elaborate theological rationalizations that allowed them to separate divine truth from human failing. But the psychological energy required for such mental gymnastics was enormous and often unsustainable. The emergence of satirical literature during this period can be understood partly as a psychological defense mechanism. Humor provided a way to process trauma that might otherwise be overwhelming. Writers like Erasmus used wit and irony to critique institutional corruption while maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid persecution. While Renaissance-era physicians lacked modern psychological vocabulary, contemporary medical texts reveal clear recognition that systematic corruption and moral betrayal could cause lasting psychological damage. Doctors described symptoms we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder in patients who had witnessed or been victims of institutional abuse. Wealthy Romans who attended Borgia court functions often sought medical treatment for mysterious ailments that appeared to have no physical cause. Physicians noted connections between attendance at papal gatherings and subsequent psychological symptoms, though they lacked theoretical frameworks to fully understand what they were observing. Women who had been forced to participate in papal entertainments frequently developed what contemporary doctors described as melancholic humors and nervous conditions. Modern readers can recognize these as symptoms of sexual trauma and complex PTSD, but Renaissance physicians could only treat symptoms without addressing underlying psychological causes. Priests and religious officials who served in the Vatican during the Borgia era showed remarkably high rates of what contemporary sources described as spiritual sickness and corruption of the soul. These men would often abandon their religious vocations entirely, unable to reconcile their faith with their direct experience of institutional depravity. The children and family members of Vatican officials also showed elevated rates of psychological distress, suggesting that trauma was transmitted across generations through family systems that had been infected by institutional corruption. Modern archaeological investigations of Renaissance-era Vatican sites have uncovered physical evidence that corroborates historical accounts of extreme papal luxury and potential debauchery. Excavations have revealed elaborate underground chambers, sophisticated ventilation systems designed to clear smoke and odors from large gatherings, and architectural modifications that could have facilitated the types of events described in contemporary sources. The psychological impact of these discoveries on modern archaeologists has been significant. Many researchers have reported feeling disturbed by physical evidence that confirms their worst suspicions about institutional corruption. The tangible reality of finding architectural features designed to facilitate orgies within sacred spaces creates a visceral understanding of historical trauma that goes beyond academic knowledge. Artifacts recovered from Borgia-era contexts reveal a level of material excess that contradicts basic Christian teachings about poverty and humility. Golden vessels designed for intimate personal use, elaborate costumes for theatrical performances, and architectural features that prioritized privacy and concealment over transparency and accountability. All provide physical testimony to the psychological corruption that characterized papal court culture. The contrast between public papal apartments designed to inspire religious awe and private chambers equipped for sensual pleasure creates a powerful psychological impact on modern visitors. The physical spaces themselves become testimonies to the systematic betrayal of religious trust that defined the Borgia era. The trauma inflicted by events like the alleged banquet of chestnuts continues to affect Catholic psychology in subtle but significant ways. Contemporary Catholics often struggle with questions of institutional trust that can be traced directly back to Renaissance-era betrayals. The psychological patterns established during the Borgia papacy continue to shape how believers relate to religious authority. Modern clerical abuse scandals resonate so powerfully, partly because they activate psychological wounds that have never fully healed. The same institutional reflexes that protected Alexander VI, the prioritization of reputation over justice, the sacrifice of victims for organizational interests, the elaborate rationalizations that transform obvious wrongs into necessary evils, continue to operate unchanged after 5 centuries. The fundamental question remains: can institutions ever truly overcome the psychological legacy of such complete moral collapse? The Catholic Church's ongoing struggles suggest that some forms of institutional trauma may be so severe, so deeply embedded in organizational DNA, that they become permanent features of institutional culture. Understanding the psychological dimensions of historical corruption thus becomes crucial for addressing contemporary institutional failures. The patterns revealed in Renaissance papal courts continue to operate in boardrooms, government offices, and other centers of power throughout the modern world. The human cost remains as devastating today as it was 5 centuries ago. The fundamental question posed by the Banquet of Chestnuts, whether human institutions can ever truly embody the moral values they claim to represent, remains as urgent today as it was 5 centuries ago. The answer we provide will determine not just the future of religious institutions, but the very possibility of moral order in human society. The stakes could not be higher, and the time for comfortable evasions has long since passed.